Hello and welcome. My name is Anthony Zalak, and I am the Recording Secretary of the 10 Mile River Scout Museum, which is located at the headquarters area of the 10 Mile River Scout Camp in Narrowsburg, New York. The museum is hosting a series of informative talks, which we hope will be of interest to the general public, as well as to the Scouts and Scout leaders. Owing to the terrible pandemic we are all living through at this time, our series of talks is being given virtually, and we are thrilled that you signed up and are here with us now. The 10 Mile River Scout Camp is located on a 12,000-acre reservation. The camp first opened in 1927, and the reservation was made possible by prominent New Yorkers led by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. The TMR Scout Museum was started in 1997 and is dedicated to preserving the history of the 10 and artifacts of the 10 Mile River Scout Camp and the local area. The museum is closed due to COVID-19. You can take a virtual tour at www.10milerivermuseum.org/historian. If you have any questions, you can call us at 845-252-2063. Question box. During this virtual talk, it's being presented on the GoToWebinar platform. You will notice you can use the questions feature. If you have a question during the presentation, please type it into the question box, and our presenter will answer as many questions as possible at the end of the presentation. Please make sure you take the brief survey after our talk. A video of this program will be available on our YouTube channel in about 3 days. And when tonight's talk is over, I will let you know about upcoming talks. Our plan is to present one talk every week or so, and the talks will be at this time on either a Tuesday or Thursday evening. You can find more information about our virtual talk series and about the TMR Scout Museum at the museum website, on our Facebook page, or in our Twitter feed. And I've listed up here the museum website, our Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube. Finally, the TMR Scout Museum is a volunteer run, except for our summer staff who get paid a small stipend. These virtual talks do incur some costs, including the fee to the GoToWebinar. We have set up a special donation page if you are so inclined to support these talks and our other museum programs. The National Park Service at the Upper Delaware Scenic and Recreational River has been a great partner in our series of virtual talks. Tonight, we will learn about an invasive plant called Knotweed, and our presenter is Jessica Newbern. Jessica is a biologist and natural resource park ranger for the National Park Service on the Upper Delaware Scenic and Recreational River since 2011. She began her career after finishing graduate school in 2010, with a thesis focused on the dietary habits of 3 northeastern Pennsylvania bat species. Since coming to the park, she has worked in water quality sampling and monitoring bat species, fish surveys, and now focuses most of her time on aquatic and terrestrial invasive species. During normal years, she coordinates the park's Watershed Steward program, where volunteers provide visitors with information on cleaning their equipment between water bodies to prevent the spread of aquatic invasive species. She is an avid naturalist, loves the challenge of identifying organisms at all levels, and uses multiple mobile applications and websites to document species occurrence and distribution both in her own time and while working in the Upper Delaware watershed. She also loves to research monarch caterpillars each year and document monarch butterfly sightings for monarch butterfly researchers. It is our pleasure to present Jessica Newbern.
Hello. Thank you for that introduction, Anthony. Tonight I am going to talk to you about knotweed. It's a plant that we have along the upper Delaware River and in our watershed that has taken over quite a few of our riparian areas, floodplains, our islands. And even though it probably would be really hard to eradicate it, that we can maybe do something about trying to manage it and contain it and stop it from spreading. And also, we're going to cover a few things about a project that the National Park Service has been working on or hopes to work on again next year, and how knotweed in its different stages of life can be used to our benefit. So first, we're going to cover what knotweed is and a little background, just some of its plant properties. It is a perennial plant, so it regrows every year compared to an annual plant, which you would have to plant each year if you wanted it to grow. It's a member of the buckwheat family of Polygonaceae, and that includes our knotweeds and our smartweeds. It grows from rhizomes, and I have one here that I had harvested last fall with a friend of mine. And the rhizomes will spread laterally underneath the ground, and that at each of these nodes, which hopefully you can see, this is a good example here and here and here, that's where it'll send up new shoots. So you can kind of imagine that as it is growing and sending out these rhizomes laterally, that's how it's easily able to establish these really dense stands that happen. Some species can also spread via seed dispersal or just cuttings, and that's kind of part of what we're going to be working on this year, or when we get the chance to finally do what we're hoping to do. It also has those same nodes that you can see along the rhizome on the stalk, and that is where the leaves will form on there. The leaves are alternate, which you could kind of see on the rhizome that, it's like on this side and then this side. That's the same way it forms above ground too. And then also if there were leaves on either side of one node, that would be considered an opposite leaf formation. You can see in these two photos, so on top, this is the false climbing buckwheat, and then on the bottom is some knotweed. And the leaves do kind of have a heart shape, and this sort of is with all of the species. Sometimes it's not as pointy at the different ends. But the flowers for all of them are produced on these stalks that are called a raceme. And you can see the flowers are formed in like a whorl around the stalk on the raceme. It has a really quick growth, and if you've ever really paid attention to knotweed in the river valley or at any of your favorite recreational spots, about in April it starts to come up out of the ground, and it's just a short little stalk with no leaves. Sometimes it's purplish in color, and then within 6 weeks you can have full growth above your head and leaves out all over. Which is one of its characteristics that makes it really good at outcompeting and being an invasive species. The stems of it are hollow, and oftentimes people do think it looks a lot like a bamboo species because of that. And with the nodes that are along the stalk too, it also kind of resembles bamboo in that way. But in those stalks, we have noticed, or I guess just since I've only been working with it for a few years, there is a significant amount of water that is contained within the stalk. So it is taking up a lot of water. And then also with its fast growth, that's all part of the way that it's able to access the nutrients and the resources that other plants might need before they get a chance. Well, knotweed gets a chance before they get a chance to get established. It is considered a non-native invasive species, and the difference between just a non-native species and a non-native invasive species is that a non-native can sometimes be introduced and not actually take over and cause problems or create these huge monocultures, which once it starts to become a threat to our native ecosystems is when it's considered it's definitely an invasive species. It's outcompeting with other things in the area. There is a biocontrol currently being tested in the Northeast. There's a few states that have released it, an insect that they're hoping will have an impact on knotweed species. And so far, the researcher seems pretty positive about it, but there hasn't been any information really released other than he does feel positive about it. In our area, we have 3 species of knotweed. We have Japanese knotweed, giant knotweed, and Bohemian knotweed. Japanese knotweed and Bohemian knotweed, I think that you'll see those together more often than the giant knotweed. We only have it in a couple of places that I'm aware of in the upper Delaware River Valley. And where it is found, it kind of almost doesn't seem like it's really taken over the way that Japanese and Bohemian knotweed can. The stand hasn't really gotten too out of hand, and I don't really see as much spreading with it, the giant knotweed, as the other 2. Along the shores of the Delaware River, on our islands, and probably often maybe on some property owners' places, you will find both Bohemian knotweed and Japanese knotweed. Giant knotweed also has a lot thinner of a stalk above ground, and it's really clear when you can see both of them, or like any of them next to each other. And it's really just the height alone. I mean, even though it just seems like 3 feet might not be that different, but it really is. The first time I saw giant knotweed, I knew it was giant knotweed, and I did not work in invasive species at that point. So why is it such a problem? So it can spread rapidly through both seeds, rhizomes, and the runners, and even rhizome fragments. So any of the times that a plant just gets washed downstream and it's still carrying all of its lovely rhizomes with it, it can get into other people's properties or just other islands, any land, and just reestablish itself. It does seem to be found often in disturbed soils and in floodplains, construction sites, and sides of roads. Oftentimes, I know that is something that I see just personally driving around, that, you know, if there is something that has just recently been developed, that a lot of times you'll start to see that little knotweed patch come up. It also underground with these rhizomes, from our experience in the fall, it wasn't very deep either. And so that really just makes it a little bit more opportunistic to have something that can grow that way and still have access to all of the things it needs as far as resources to grow. It also crowds out all native riparian vegetation. And this causes problems for both erosion and that our native riparian vegetation provides both pollinators and our other organisms, and even the river, certain protection against things like erosion, and it provides habitat for different organisms. It is able to inhibit succession by slow growing plants like trees and shrubs, and this is exactly the way that it ends up just kind of taking over, and little by little, as it can expand itself, it is creating shade. And you can imagine that May is like such an important month for growth for many of our plants, that it's creating shade, it's sucking up all the water, it's taking up all the nutrients, and it's really just making it hard for anything else to grow in those areas. It can lead to stream bank destabilization, or I would say it does lead to stream bank destabilization. There's definitely erosion, soil loss, and it also can create, we kind of see this at Skinner's, the soil running off of the knotweed stands has sort of made a muddy area in between the 2 different stands. And so it does create like its own new just muddy patches where it can, where there is the soil erosion. It was initially planted some places for stabilization of banks, which is kind of surprising, but it was. And so the monocultural, the way that it just is such a dense stand of the same plant, it really affects the habitat for pollinators and other insects and even animals that just require native vegetation. And sometimes they require, it's not just insects as far as needing a host plant, but it's also things like, you know, certain trees that birds might need to nest in, or just certain plant communities that other animals would need for that, for both breeding and for nourishment and for protection too. The other problem with knotweed would be that it is everywhere. Surprisingly, since it has been established in 1991, and maybe kind of see, or at least that's as early as I know of with as far as work up here with it. But even though that it has kind of become established, that it is everywhere, but it's not really everywhere. But at the same time, when you find it or where it is, there are just usually huge stands of it. This is at Callicoon on the Delaware River, the main stem. For orientation, this is Callicoon Creek here. This is the New York side. This is the PA side. And this is the island immediately upstream of the Callicoon Bridge. And it's just covered with knotweed. And then the island just up from there, you can see all along the edge here that it's covered with knotweed. And then you've got some in here that's growing, and then again on the edge out here. And one of the things that you'll see as one of our management techniques that we're going to use at our demo site for controlling knotweed is repeated cutting. And you see this, I would say, at a good number of private landowners along the river, if you're floating down the river, that if they do mow it, that they can have these nice paths that kind of lead down to the river. And there are some people who kind of like the knotweed does give them privacy from just people on the river and from their neighbors. Another part of this is River Road in Callicoon, which most of the landowners on this road are actively controlling knotweed. And there's just actually a few spots where it occurs in stands. And that's something that I've noticed just biking in that area. Another, how it's everywhere, it really does take over some of our islands in the river, which is, just, it's not what they're supposed to look like. So, that's another reason that it's a problem. So this is at Balls Eddy. This is the Fish and Boat, Pennsylvania Fish and Boat launch. And this actually is the West Branch Delaware River, not the main stem. Balls Creek comes out right here and runs up in this area. And literally from here, almost right up to the access, it's just a solid knotweed stand. The positive thing about this site, though, is that it has shown over the years and all my years of visiting the site that it doesn't quite go past a certain stand of native vegetation that's there, which is another one of the ways that we've kind of been thinking about how we want to design what we're going to do with the project that we're working on this in the next couple of years. So as an example of what a healthy riparian vegetation would look like, this is what these slides are, or this slide is for. Another important part of really being able to, and in the next slides, we're going to see some of how there is more erosion and sedimentation loss with knotweed stands. And if you think about when this all dies away and it's done for the year, it sort of lays down on top of itself. And it creates like a mat, and the soil is held in there. And even if there is heavy rainfall, or I guess even maybe ice scour, that it's not really taking, or it's not really causing any of the sediment to run off. There's something to help the water be absorbed into the soil, rather than water hitting dry soil and it just turning it into a mess where the dirt just runs off with it. As an example of the soil erosion, and I feel like I'm fairly certain this might be Skinner's Falls area here. You can see that under the knotweed, there's a lot of bare areas. So it does die off, it grows, these stalks all die off, and they just remain behind as just dead material. And that in the spring, if we were to get heavy rainfall after it's been frozen all year, the soil is, not used to anything there, that as soon as rain starts to hit this, because there's nothing really to help absorb the energy of the water falling to the ground, that it just picks up the dirt molecules and sediment just can run right off. And over here you can see that, as it has to hit the ground, it has to go through vegetation. It really provides a buffer and protects the river from being having too much sediment deposited in it. And the reason that we don't want a lot of sedimentation in the river is because that can cause, it shifts the aquatic habitat, and it can change what can be found there too, and it can smother species that are in there, and it really doesn't provide the right habitat for a lot of what we have in the river. Not only that, where knotweed is found with tree species, because of the way that it forms, and that, again, there's so much space in between that there's just nothing really to stop the water from grabbing the dirt and just running away with it. So when thinking about how to approach the knotweed problem, which it's definitely a problem, you know, you kind of think of it in different ways. Eradication of large patches, it's kind of really difficult to do, and it can be really expensive, and it can also be really time intensive and labor intensive. Early detection and eradication of isolated populations, this works relatively well, and it's pretty easy because it can be contained and it can be controlled with that repeated cutting. You can contain it depending on what your objective is at the site, and I would use, you know, initially I'll be showing the Skinner's Falls access and describing kind of what we started last year with there. And, you know, that really our objective at that point was just to kind of keep the path open, you know, and that with repeated cutting each year and just keep doing it, you can actually contain a population like that. Control, you can allow, so when you do control it, you are allowing for the other vegetation to have exposure to sun and light, air, and the resources also. And then one of the things that we've kind of been talking about, well, or maybe I know I talk a lot about, is that, you know, when you pick what you're going to have next as your vegetation, or what you maybe will pick selectively to let stay as your next vegetation if you are cutting knotweed, that maybe you can kind of control whether or not the knotweed is going to have a chance at coming back. So some of the management techniques that are currently available, so repeated mechanical cutting, again, that does work. It is time and labor intensive, but it definitely does work. There is covering with a geotextile membrane, or even some people have used tarps. This does work. It will also kill everything else that's under the membrane or the tarp. And then depending on the actual geotextile membrane materials can be pretty expensive, but if you were using something like a tarp, its exposure to the sun can start to break it down, and also sometimes then eventually the knotweed can like poke right through it. You also have to kind of be attentive and make sure that your edges of your tarp or whatever you're covering it with is definitely held down by something, because knotweed will grow right out the side of that. There is herbicide use. There's the foliar application, which is a leaf application, and this is usually recommended that you would cut your knotweed twice during the growing season. This is done because, one, the knotweed is then forced to put out new leaves and grow new stuff, and so when it does do that, it's also pulling energy out of its rhizomes and then putting it back up into the plant. So not only are you reducing the rhizome, you're also eventually, hopefully, going to affect the above ground stuff too. This also makes it much shorter. So when you are doing a foliar application, it's much safer for the applicator to have something that's at 3 feet tall rather than 8 to 10 feet tall, because then they're spraying above their head and they're much more likely to be exposed to the herbicides. You can also do a stem injection with herbicides. This is 100% undiluted when you do this, and it does involve just injecting into the knotweed between the first and second node above the ground about 5 milliliters of herbicide, and then you do this in the fall, because in the fall is when the plant is experiencing senescing, so it's pulling all of its resources down into the rhizome and taking it away from the above ground growth. And so at the same time, it also takes down and into its rhizomes the herbicide. hopefully effectively eradicating the plant from where it's at. And this is a treatment that we're going to be doing this year with the Park Service. You can also have foraging. Goats and sheep are commonly used for foraging. There are some popular trails in Pennsylvania, I know, that have employed this, and this is one of the management techniques that we're going to do as part of our demo sites with Friends of the Upper Delaware River. Burning is a technique that is used on some invasive species. The thing with burning with knotweed is that it could definitely pose more of a risk of getting out of control, maybe when it has died away, and that you just have all these dead, dry stalks above ground. But at that point, you're not really getting down to the rhizome, and since it does really kind of spend all of its energy overwintering in the rhizome, you really wouldn't be efficient. And then I had talked about earlier that knotweed contains a lot of water. So in the summer, even if it was in full green leaf, it's really hard to burn knotweed. And that is, I also learned that from the National Park Service, the burn crews that do burning for invasive species. The biocontrol, I think I mentioned earlier, it has just been started up in the Northeast. There are a few states that are participating. New York is one of them, and they released in the Adirondacks area. So we're just kind of waiting to see what happens with that, and if it is positive, because we definitely have some sites where we could easily release a biocontrol. Biocontrols, though, also are usually something that's done more research-based or by agency rather than private landowners. It's a pretty complicated process. There's some permits you have to get, and you have to have study plans, follow-up plans. So it's usually done by agencies rather than just being done by landowners. Electrocution is one that has been, I guess I would say, floated around. I did have a friend ask me if I'd ever heard of it because she knew a farmer who locally was using this as a technique to control the knotweed on their property. There has been some talk over in the UK that I have learned from some of the people I work with the Catskill Regional Invasive Species Partnership. But when I've Googled it or tried to look into it as a management technique, I don't usually find that it's something that you can find out the results of. So it's definitely interesting. I can see how with all the water that's in it, that would be an effective technique potentially. Freezing is another one that could be used, but it's a little bit unfeasible just based on what you would need to do it. The freezing of it does cause it to senesce early, which is like what it does in the fall when it turns into the red and it's ready to just be done, and it's pulling everything back into the ground. But whether or not it could be used and how much of a freezing agent like liquid nitrogen you would need to use would probably not be great. So the National Park Service was approached by Friends of the Upper Delaware River when they were applying for a National Fish and Wildlife Foundation Delaware River Conservation Fund grant. And they wanted to, there's a few things involved with the project, but one of the things that they wanted to start was doing demo sites so that people in the area could come and learn more about the different techniques and methods and what we're learning as we are doing them, and sharing just our results of what we're seeing, what we think is working, what's not working. And then, kind of how much you might have to spend, what kind of effort you might have to put in to doing the different techniques. And so we were happy to partner with them, and we were already starting to do some mechanical cutting at Skinner's Falls, which is this is the demo site for that. And so we were kind of happy to be like, yeah, we were looking into this too, so let's work on it together. So this is the Skinner's Falls, New York State DEC river access. For orientation, again, this is the parking lot here. This is the New York side of the river. Here's the Skinner's Falls Bridge. And this is the path that leads to the river at the access. Back in 2018, there were a few safety complaints sort of put in, as far as that not only can river users not see that this is the takeout if they're coming down and this is where they're supposed to get out of the river, from the river, but that also that the rangers who are normally up here in a kiosk can't really see down to the river through all the knotweed. And also just like personal preference, if you were to visit this site and even maybe now, I mean, I haven't actually walked down there in a while, but that when you would go to visit there, that you would have to kind of carry all of your equipment through dense vegetation that was growing over the path down to the river. And I just don't think most people like to do that when they're getting to the river. So we decided in 2019 that we would start cutting at Skinner's Falls. And it was to do kind of one of two things. You know, we knew mechanical cutting could work, but we also were kind of interested in which plants were able to come back fast with the mechanical cutting. We used just head shears when we did it, and we were specific to avoid the native vegetation that was there because we wanted to give them as much of a fighting chance as possible. So we agreed to sign up and to recruit people to help us with keeping this path clear with mechanical cutting for at least the next year. We'll see if it does continue into the year after that. The other treatment plants that are treatment or management that we would do of knotweed would be the foliar, the leaf application of herbicide here, the injection of the stems in this section, the cut and cover here, and then here would be a control, and there would be nothing happening in this area. It would be allowed to grow. And then at the very end, we would do our grazing, and we were going to, we are hiring a goat farmer who will be providing goats in a trailer for them. And we're planning to have, you know, outside of all of this, you know, some information about what's going on in each of these plots and why we chose this management technique and what we're kind of trying to show. And, you know, just kind of people have options as to how they might want to treat knotweed on their own property. So out of the study or the project that we're doing with FUDR, our Friends of the Upper Delaware River, there's some other studies that are going to happen as part of it. And I know I'm missing some of them from this, but one of them is that the sedimentation migration into the river. So when we do have all of that sediment that's running off from underneath knotweed stands, and some of our tributaries are chock full of knotweed too. So they're, you know, all of that sediment as well, is trying to get an idea of just how much sediment is coming from these thick knotweed stands. And so using, which the science of how they're doing it is kind of outside of my specialty, but they are going to be able to calculate that, and we're, I believe, hoping that we can kind of then get a number of like just how much is this actually impacting the river. Because one of the things I think that both my agency and Friends of the Upper Delaware River have in common is trying to protect the river, and sedimentation is definitely not a positive when it comes to our healthy aquatic ecosystems. Another part of the project is to use the digital imagery, like the flight over Callicoon I had showed before, and kind of mapping that on other GIS layers to sort of get the extent of how much knotweed is within the 100-year floodplain. And on top of that, using, after you have a number of the extent, you know, to say, well, if there's this much sediment that runs off from this amount of knotweed in a stand, like how much is that in the 100-year floodplain? There will also be the pre and post management identification of plants. So is there anything that can even grow with knotweed beforehand, and then what does come back? And based on the management technique, does that influence which plants do come up next? We are also going to be working with one of our rangers, who is a teacher at a local school, on identifying whether the 3 different species in the park can propagate from seed, stalk, or rhizome. And with the stalk and the rhizome, we're focusing on like a leaf cutting, like you can do with some plants, or if it needs to be a chunk of the node where the leaves actually grow from, or if it can just be any part of the plant. This way, people can know whether or not, if they cut the knotweed, what they need to do with it. And then again, not all of them are supposed to reproduce from seed, and so finding out which ones might. And same with the stalk, the rhizome is like, is it just a piece of the rhizome, or does it need to be that specific node area? Another question we are looking at answering is with this, with our teacher and a local school, is finding out how much water weight knotweed has. I tried to do some quick Googling on this, I think this last spring, and nobody really had the answer to it. And so I'm really curious about this with all of the water issues that and the competition for water on the upper Delaware, you know, just how much water is knotweed holding, and, you know, like, could that impact what is happening in the river? So the knotweed benefits, it is nesting habitat for red-winged blackbirds. They're the most common bird found, with nests in Japanese, or knotweed specifically. And it does provide cover for other animals too. There's a groundhog who is perfectly happy living in the knotweed at Skinner's. And you'll even see sometimes river otter slides going through knotweed too. So it really does provide a cover for them. And I've even seen some beaver dams sometimes that have knotweed sort of like shoved into their, or not their dams, but into their, I'm not going to remember the word, but into their homes. So it is also a nectar and pollen source for pollinators for 2 weeks per year. But if we had our native riparian vegetation, it's good at blooming at different times of year, and so it provides a lot longer of a season for all of our pollinators and that need nectar and pollen. Because knotweed just spends so much of its time just in green state. It's really just not very beneficial. The young knotweed shoots are, I think, pretty delicious. They do taste, I think, just like rhubarb. I did try roasting them like asparagus. That did not work out, but I have used it as rhubarb, and it does taste a lot like that. The rhizomes, which I showed you before, are a good source of resveratrol, which is good for, it can be good for heart issues, and they have been using it to treat Lyme as a, you can turn it into a tincture, and they have been using it to treat Lyme. And I mean, per social media, there are people who do vow that it has been worked, or that it does work. Also, it could be used potentially, we think, as flatware and other products. You do find things like bamboo flatware and bamboo paper plates and other products like that. And so whether or not it could be used in that same way, I don't know that it's been explored, but it seems like it should be able to, based on the properties. Other products too is whether or not you can actually build with the dead knotweed in the winter after it's, you know, turned into those stalks, and that if you were able to cut it and treat it, could you build stuff with it the same way that you could with bamboo? So here are some links, and I know this is being recorded, so it should be available for everyone, or you could just take a picture of your screen if you wanted to right now. Both the ID and treatment methods that can be done, and then some recipes. And you can just like Google also recipes for knotweed and find plenty. Pickled knotweed is pretty tasty. I've tried that. I just don't think my pickle recipe is up to par yet, but I still ate them. They were good. So I just want to put this slide up. My contact information is at the bottom, and that, you know, these are all of the different groups that I pulled out of the application for funding, and that we had put out there, and people I know that are involved with this project, with Friends of the Upper Delaware River, and our part in it, just with the recruiting of volunteers and the education and outreach about knotweed, which is kind of what this is about. And I will let it be switched over for questions.
Okay.
Okay, thank you very much, Jessica. That was really, really good. Oh, by the way, this is Mitchell Slepian. I'm the vice chair of the TMR Scout Museum, and we have a bunch of questions. And you actually answered mine about what it tastes like, because I was kind of interested, because we do a wilderness survival merit badge when we go into the woods and try and survive. It's one of the requirements, and one of the requirements is to figure out what plant life is edible. So that was really, really good to know. Okay, so jumping into some other questions. Where were the Bohemian and Japanese knotweeds introduced into the U.S. or regionally near the Delaware? And to couple onto that question, some of the questions are similar. And during your investigation, what is the earliest historical botanical accounting of its presence by the Delaware?
That's a great question. So I've actually tried to remember this earlier. It's either Wayne County, Pennsylvania on the upper Delaware has either its first documented case of it, or I guess plant, either in 1981 or 1991. And I can definitely get back to that question later, because it's something that that's another part of, like, you know, it hasn't taken over everywhere, even though it's been here as long as it's been here. And so that's why kind of looking at these plant communities that don't seem to be invaded is one of the tactics we're kind of exploring.
Great, great, great. And we're going to jump into another question that's really a double header, but I'll ask the first part first. What herbicide can you use near the river?
You can use glyphosate near the river. Rodeo is one that is safe for, it's, you know what? That's another one I'll have to get back to you on. I know the one that I'm using is a glyphosate for injection. It does not go into so once it gets absorbed into the rhizomes, it doesn't actually leave the rhizomes. So it stays in the plant.
Great. And does that require hiring a New York State DEC certified applicator? And is there a price tag on this and a certain time frame in terms of controlling the species? Although you probably won't ever be able to fully eradicate it. What are the thoughts on that?
Okay. So the first part was, does it require a New York State licensed applicator?
Yes.
So if it's your own private property, I believe people are still able to go to Home Depot or Lowe's or different centers and are able to purchase the herbicide that can be used for knotweed. If you did have to go with a licensed applicator in New York, I do believe it can be pricey, because New York, through its licensed applicators, does try to keep as little herbicide out there as possible, and there's a lot of reporting and what you're going to use, where you're going to use it, and when you're going to use it rules.
Perfect. And then the next couple of questions are similar too, so I'm just going to kind of combine them. Is knotweed in other areas or just around the Delaware? And is there any knotweed around any of the lakes in 10 Mile River in the camp itself?
I don't remember if it's around the lakes. I don't recall seeing it around the lakes at the Boy Scout camp. Is it found in other places? Absolutely. The Northwest also suffers with knotweed quite a bit on their shores of their rivers too. And it's prolific throughout the Northeast.
Great, great, great. And I thank you for answering the questions. And if anybody didn't think of any questions, still you could pop them in the question box for another minute or so. And if you have any other questions that you think of tonight or tomorrow morning, just email us through GoToWebinar and we will get your answers. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Anthony to do a wrap up. And thank you very much. This was really interesting. And I love the Skinner Falls part of it. As a camper and staff for TMR, we spend a lot of time in that area. Anthony, it's all yours.
All right. Well, the TMR Scout Museum would like to extend our deep gratitude to Jessica Newbern for tonight's interesting and informative talk. We hope you have enjoyed it, and that you will join us again for our future talks in the next few days. In the next few days, you will receive an email from the GoToWebinar with copies of tonight's slides and a link to the recording of tonight's presentation. A copy of the recording would also be available on our YouTube channel. Our next talk will be on Tuesday, August 11th at 7 p.m., and it is called How to Do an Improv Scene. Our presenter will be Ken Adams, author of How to Improvise a Full-Length Play and artistic director of Synergy Theater, Walnut Creek, California. Ken is a Chappie alumni from the 1980s. He's also an Eagle Scout and was a chapter chief in Shashuga Lodge. So we hope you can all join us for that. So again, please support the museum programs like this. Go to our website, tmrmuseum.org, to donate, our Facebook, Twitter, or YouTube account. And once again, thank you everybody for taking part this evening. Have a good night.